In January of 2009, Nike introduced Pro Combat, a brand new style of Nike wear with innovative padding for athletes, giving football players lighter, stronger, and more breathable base layer protection. I certainly remember everybody in grade school wearing this stuff when it first came out, and players actually started wearing this in college at the end of the 2008 season and into the 2009 bowl games. And the Nike Pro Combat era was about to take off. But Nike had bigger ideas for Pro Combat. They didn't just want it to be under protection that players would wear, they wanted to design uniforms. And in November of 2009, Nike would select 11 special schools to participate in a first of its kind special release, the Nike Pro Combat uniforms. Now up until this point, Nike had fitted a lot of schools for different types of uniforms, but this was at the very beginning of the uniform era takeoff, where now we see Nike have so many types of designs for all sorts of teams, whether it's in the NBA or the NFL. So we've become numb a little bit to special uniforms. But when these first came out, nobody had ever seen anything like this. The specific design that Nike took with these was certainly interesting. They tried to make a futuristic uniform, but also try to bring in some elements that each specific school had to make the uniform stand out in its own unique way. And the Nike Pro Combat era uniforms definitely got a lot of attention. Now, the 2009 release, the design on these uniforms were certainly unique. They had the fly wire on both the shoulder pads, and each team had a silver shield logo on the middle of the collar. And Nike said that these uniforms were designed to address the evolution in the game because today's players were faster and stronger, and the uniforms were lighter and did not hold water and sweat. They also designed the uniforms with the Nike Pro Combat underpadding, like I've said, and the 10 special schools that were able to wear these uniforms, well, some of them are certainly interesting. Nobody knows exactly why Nike chose these 10 schools. Now let's go into each school specifically for the 2009 season. Florida was chosen, which they wore their blue uniforms. Ohio State was chosen as well, wearing a little bit of a throwback in their white uniforms. Florida State stood out the most in my opinion with their red uniforms. Oklahoma went with a clean white look. LSU also went with a clean white look as well. And Miami went with a white look too, with a mix of white, orange, and green, and the only team I think with colored flywire. TCU had a really interesting look, probably my favorite of the bunch. Texas, they also went with a white look, a little bit of a retro with the numbers on the helmet. Virginia Tech had a gradient on their numbers, and finally Missouri was chosen. They had a matte helmet. So a lot of these uniforms had different styles and different approaches to how each one was designed. There's one more school that was not marketed but got a Pro Combat uniform, which was Clemson, and they had white uniforms, nothing too crazy on theirs, but it is interesting looking back because they said and only marketed 10 schools, however there was actually 11. Now the reason a lot of people have a lot of nostalgia for these uniforms, even if they didn't necessarily like these schools, was playing NCAA football with them. In July of 2010, NCAA Football 11 featured Tim Tebow on the cover, and he was wearing one of these uniforms on the Xbox 360 cover, and for the demo of this game, the demo version featured these uniforms as the only playable teams, and I'm sure a lot of you have a lot of memories playing with these uniforms in this game. Now, Nike Pro Combat was football specific. Nike Basketball never went into the Pro Combat route, which is kind of what made this stand out because it was a really special thing where only 11 schools were involved with this, and it was only for the sport of football. It was never for the sport of basketball. Now, 2009 was not the only year that Nike made these Pro Combat uniforms, because they came back, and in September of 2010, they announced their second wave of these uniforms. Now, what they did with these was they removed the fly wire from the shoulder pads, so only 2009 Pro Combat uniforms wore those. However, they allowed the teams this time to actually wear some of these uniforms versus each other, because in 2009, they wanted each uniform to kind of stand out on their own. They never wanted the uniforms to clash because some of the teams actually did end up playing each other, but they changed that rule for 2010. So you saw some of these uniforms go up against each other, whether it was Virginia Tech and Boise State playing at FedEx Field, or Pitt and West Virginia wearing these in the backyard brawl in November. Now we saw a couple repeat teams from 2009, but we also saw some new schools. Now these uniforms took a little bit even more of a chance this time, where instead of just seeing some white uniforms that really didn't have a whole lot of design to them, this year's definitely did. And we'll start off with Florida again. This year they were wearing a white uniform with gator skin striping on the uniform. Ohio State was actually wearing a red uniform this year, honoring the 1942 team led by Coach Paul Brown. This team lost a lot of players to the war, so they also wore an American flag on their uniform. Now Virginia Tech might be my favorite. They honored their Corps of Cadets, since Virginia Tech is only one of 2 schools to have a military program at a state university. TCU once again brought back the same style of uniform they wore the previous year. Miami took a bold approach going with a orange and green uniform. Alabama joined the group inspired by their 1978 national championship team. They also wore houndstooth numbering on their uniforms to match Bear Bryant's iconic hat that he used to wear. Boise State was picked due to their recent success, and their uniform had all sorts of quirks, and Nike said this was due to how unpredictable Boise State was as a team. Oregon State joined the group, their 1967 team. They were known as Giant Killers that season, so their uniforms honored them, and were the only team that did not have a shield on the collar. Pittsburgh joined the group as well. Theirs were inspired by the steel industry, and their helmet was textured to look like a hard hat. And finally, West Virginia, who their uniforms were similar to Pittsburgh because theirs represented the coal mine approach to their area, so a lot of theirs had black smudges on them to represent the coal mines. So in my opinion, I honestly thought that the 2010 Pro Combat uniforms were the best of the bunch, but Nike was not done again because they would come back in 2011 and make a round 3 of these uniforms where they picked Oregon, Georgia, Boise State, Michigan State, Stanford, LSU, Ohio State, Army, and Navy. Now this would sadly be the end of the Nike Pro Combat era because Nike wanted to move on from this approach, and they also were moving over to the NFL. They had to design all of their uniforms, and people did speculate, and I remember this at the time, if Nike would introduce some Pro Combat style uniforms for the National Football League, and if we would see some of those. Thankfully, they did not do that. Now, Nike never officially said there was an end to the Nike Pro Combat era. What they did though is they just started incorporating Nike Pro Combat into a lot of their uniforms, and specifically with how the jerseys were designed. We actually even saw schools just completely switch to Pro Combat as their uniform style. With Arkansas, Rutgers, they both took that approach to just incorporate all of Nike Pro Combat into their design, and we saw a lot of these designs in the NFL, in college football, happen as uniforms have evolved. So the novelty of that era of 2009, 2010, and 2011, that era ended with the shield in the middle, you know, the fly wire on the shoulders, and Nike just started upgrading how they produced all their uniforms altogether. Nike obviously has released a ton of different uniforms, and a lot of schools get throwbacks every year, so we really never have to go back to an era like this. Now, I'm very nostalgic for that 2010 era college football. That was the era I grew up with, and a lot of you watching grew up with, so you probably are a little bit nostalgic for these uniforms. I do think it would be kind of fun though, if sometime in the future, Nike actually brought those uniforms back for a one-time appearance. Like, wouldn't it be fun to see these uniforms again? Because again, the whole point of these uniforms were to be uniforms for the future, and not everybody wanted that, because people are nostalgic for their uniforms and they want something traditional and clean, which I understand and I completely agree with the older I've gotten. So that's gonna do it for this video about the Nike Pro Combat era. Let me know down in the comments section what you guys think about this era and what you thought about these uniforms, whether you played with them in NCAA football or even if you owned some of these jerseys, because I remember getting this Tebow one as a kid and got the Ohio State and the TCU one the older I got, and I just am really nostalgic for these jerseys. Say hi to the dog there. So yeah, that's about all I've got on these uniforms. Once again, thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.